I just want you to know that the alliance can save Ukrainian lives from Russia's strikes, from Russia's occupation, if we can get all the weapons we need.
President Volodymyr Zelensky made this request to NATO members on what is a grim milestone. Today marks 1 month since Russia invaded Ukraine. On February the 24th, Russian President Vladimir Putin made the declaration of what he called a special military operation. Putin said the goal was the, quote, demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. And so today, NATO member states convened in Brussels with the organization offering up more military support. But is it enough? Let's hear first.
We will be sending more lethal equipment to Ukraine in the coming days and weeks, as we've committed to do. We're going to continue to try and help out in the best possible way we can.
We're looking at what we can do to help, but I've got to tell you, logistically at the moment, it looks very difficult, but both with armour and with jets. We're very conscious of what he's asking for.
Okay, world leaders conscious of what President Zelensky is asking for, and they have elaborated a bit on what they're offering. But is this support enough? 1 month into this conflict. Joining us now are CTV's military analyst, retired Major General David Fraser, and Tina J. Park, Junior Fellow at the Bill Graham Center for Contemporary International History at the University of Toronto. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight. I'm going to start with you, Major General Fraser. President Zelensky has asked NATO member states for high-end military equipment. He says his country urgently needs tanks, aircraft, anti-ship missile systems. Canada has provided things like machine guns, handguns, ammunition. Is this an appropriate response from Canada so far, considering our donation stock is low?
Well, Christina, I mean, there's a big ask from President Zelensky. He's asking for a lot more than what NATO, including Canada, is prepared to give. And simply put, it's that NATO doesn't want to have this war expand outside the confines of Ukraine. And Putin has actually indicated what he's prepared to accept and not accept. But, there is a line in the sand today that wasn't there yesterday, and that's on the use of chemical weapons. And the president has indicated that he will respond in kind to Russia if he does that. But fundamentally, Ukraine will get all the resources that they need. At this moment in time, it will not include a no-fly zone, aircraft, or probably tanks.
We're going to talk about that no-fly zone, retired Major General, in a moment. But, Tina, I want to elaborate on something the General talked about, NATO's role. As you know, NATO's military role includes the peaceful resolution of disputes and, in a situation of crisis management operations. Is what President Zelensky, what he's asking for, beyond NATO's mandate and role?
Well, yes, I think Mr. Zelensky is very desperate for more weapons and more help, and he has been calling for no-fly zone, for instance, which is really beyond the scope of what NATO is able to provide. We have to remember that NATO is a defensive alliance, and NATO's responsibilities for collective defense really extends to the member states. That said, I think we've seen a remarkable degree of solidarity and support from all NATO member states when it comes to supporting Ukraine through humanitarian, economic, and political means. And I think the alliance will continue to help people of Ukraine promote their territorial integrity and defend their freedom. But we have to be very careful to not escalate this conflict into another war at a global scale that, frankly, nobody is ready to sort of deal with at this point.
Yeah, it appears to be a very cautious approach and appropriate approach when you consider NATO's role and that request for a no-fly zone, which President Zelensky has pressed NATO and its member states for time and time again. He continues to get a no answer to that. Tina, we don't anticipate that will change because President Vladimir Putin has warned that any move to create a no-fly zone above Ukraine would be viewed as participation in the conflict. So would you agree that this is going to be a consistent no?
Absolutely. I think when you impose a no-fly zone, you have to be willing to shoot down the enemy's plane. And if we were to shoot down Russian planes from the NATO's end, that is seen as a declaration of war by the Russian side. And I think that is the last thing we want. Ceasefire is in everybody's interest, including Russia's, because we're seeing a continued escalation of conflict on the ground, and the refugee crisis in Ukraine is at a level that we have not seen since the Second World War. So countries like Poland have stepped up, and certainly all European countries have welcomed Ukrainian refugees, and I think Canada will do the same. But there are clear limits to the humanitarian capacity that the international community has. So the longer the conflict lasts, the more difficult it will be for everybody involved, and we really have to resort to diplomatic and political solutions for putting this crisis to an end.
Mm-hmm. And here, yet we are a month in. Major General, President Biden today was asked about the potential for the use of chemical weapons. He would not elaborate, of course, on what intelligence the U.S. has. Jens Stoltenberg, NATO's Jens Stoltenberg, has agreed to provide Ukraine with greater support in the event of a chemical, biological, or nuclear attack. He says NATO has activated their own defenses. What does that mean?
Well, Christina, there's a couple of things. First of all, there is a team in Washington working on what would happen if Russia did launch a chemical or biological attack. And the president, let's be clear, the president just said today that if Russia did that, they would get attacked by the West, and it would be proportional, and he was not going to give anything more than that. And that is probably the strongest statement that we've heard from the President of the United States, and that is directed at Putin. So, in fact, the line in the sand has been given, so that should actually push Putin back into its box. The other thing is there's 100,000 Americans now sitting in Europe, 40,000 of the NATO reaction force is gone, 4 additional battle groups. NATO has got, as we would say in the military, stood to with all their weapons pointed at Russia. So Putin has now got a whole bunch of guns pointed at his head, and he's got a line in the sand that if he fires those unmentionable weapon systems, it's going to hurt him badly.
Mm-hmm. What about the role of international troops in terms of the support being provided by troops from the West? We heard NATO's Jens Stoltenberg say today, as much as NATO member states and NATO as an organization is willing to provide support, it's not peacekeeping in the sense that we will see troops move into Ukraine. Is that something that we would see at some point, and if so, when, Major General?
The short answer is no. NATO is a defensive force. Everything that's been done today has been proportional, non-escalatory. It will be a persistent presence, but it's about 140,000 plus troops now that are on the border between NATO and Russia as a deterrent. And after the Russian performance in Ukraine so far, Russia would be absolutely silly to try to come into NATO because NATO would destroy them. Mm-hmm. So right now, this is a defensive measure, but there are also indications of Russia, if they did anything else, of what the United States would do to them.
Tina, on that note, President Zelensky warning today that Russia poses a threat to NATO nations in Eastern Europe. Is that something you would consider to be an accurate and imminent threat?
Well, I think it's up for discussion, actually, because NATO has strengthened our eastern flank since the latest Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we certainly have NATO member states surrounding Ukraine who may be exposed if Russia decided to expand. But I think Russia is also aware, Mr. Putin is certainly aware that any attack on a NATO member state will be an attack against all of us. And that really escalates the level of confrontation to a different level. And should it become a very global sort of attack on the alliance, then NATO will respond accordingly. We have already seen strengthening of our eastern flank, and NATO is certainly very much interested in protecting the territorial integrity of member states. So I think there is a lot at stake, and all parties are aware of what is at stake.
And Major General, if we can end it with you here. We started off this discussion asking, is what Canada offering, is what the international community, specifically the NATO member states, what they're offering, is it enough? Because we continue to see from these nations, yes, the promises of some help, like Prime Minister Trudeau noted today, to secure some more weapons for Ukraine, but additional sanctions. I mean, is this enough? Or are these sanctions having enough of an impact?
Well, Canada is running in parallel with the rest of the world. We've sanctioned as much as we can, and we've added a whole bunch more today. So I think that, that's commensurate with everyone else. What we have provided from a military point of view, that's quite frankly a question for the politicians, because, the Canadian Forces only has so much, and it's a function of how much they've been able to acquire over the last, 10, 15 years. And if you aren't able to acquire it, you don't have it to share with other people. So I think that's where we are at a bigger debate, is on our defense policy. Is there enough money and enough capability in the Defense Force necessary to not only defend our nation, including the Arctic, but also to participate in NATO in a meaningful way? And I think right now we're fighting in a war. Maybe we could have done a little bit more.
And as Defense Minister Anita Anand has noted, our potential for more donation, that stock is running low. We have to leave it there. Major General and Tina, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Christina.